Okay, everybody, welcome back. It is good to be back, of course. I've been in Florida for about 2 weeks doing the vacation thing, and I'm home now. And we're going to talk about the problem of evil, the problems of evil, I should say. And I want to map the terrain of the different responses from the theistic side, the different approaches that theists take or have taken when it comes to addressing the problem of evil. And by that, I mean the evidential problem of evil. I have a new Substack up. For those of you who are my subscribers, you've probably already seen this, and this will serve as a general outline to this conversation. If you want to read the full thing, I'll link it in the description or show notes. It is called 8 or So Responses to the Problem of Evil. Before we get started on that, I should begin with some preliminaries. So I said problems of evil, and I meant it. There's different ways of thinking about how evil might be a problem for theism, and of course, it's a problem presumably for theists, right? That's how this is typically situated. Why? Well, seems pretty obvious, right? I mean, traditional theism, anyways, is committed to the idea that the sort of foundational ground or layer of reality is absolute perfection, right? Is pure actuality, the fullness of being, and then we have this sort of omni-God, a God that is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, or all good. And does that really play well with the suffering and evil of our experience? That's the sort of general problem. But it comes in different forms and different flavors. So one form is very strong. It's the logical problem of evil. And as many people have noted, it seems like this form of the problem of evil has sort of died out. It's sort of been thrown into the philosophical dustbin because it's claiming something very strong. It's claiming that there's just like an outright impossibility between the occurrence of bad stuff in our world and the existence of God. There's really just something contradictory about these things. The problem is nobody has been able to really draw out just what that contradiction is, because it usually gets caught up on a problem of showing that God couldn't have a reason, right? That God couldn't have a God justifying reason for allowing the bad stuff of our world, of our universe. Now, let me be clear. When I say I'm going to use the term bad stuff a lot in this conversation, I used it in my little blog article, and I'm not like saying bad stuff to in any way downplay the very real atrociousness that we often encounter in reality. I'm using the term bad stuff because I'm looking for something that's sufficiently general to cover both moral evil and natural evil. So sometimes if you just use the term evil, people will think just moral evil, the evil that agents like us, rational agents, commit. But of course, the problem of evil is wider than that. It needs to, if you're responding to the problem of evil, yes, moral evil is one aspect of that, but you also have to account for natural evils, things like people dying in earthquakes and bone cancer and all that sort of thing, right? So that's what I mean when I use the term bad stuff, just anything that's bad, right? All right, so that's the logical problem of evil. We're not going to spend too much time on that because I don't think we have to. Most of the debate has sort of moved towards these evidential problems of evil. We'll talk about that in a minute, but there's a third category that doesn't get talked about as much these days, and that's the sort of metaphysical problem of evil. And that deals, of course, on a more sort of deeper metaphysical level of what is the metaphysical status of evil, and is that compatible with the existence of God? Is evil something that God actually like actively creates? And this is an important thing to think about. We won't spend too much time on it in this conversation, but the general way theists have thought about the metaphysical problem of evil, or offered a solution to it, is what's called through the privation theory of evil. That evil isn't something that sort of has a positive ontological status, if you will. That defects are not things. And there's many different schools of thought on this. And there's, in fact, a very recent defense of this view by Dr. David Oderberg called The Metaphysics of Good and Evil. It's a phenomenal book. David Alexander also has a book on this, God, Goodness, and Evil. These both deal with the metaphysical problem of evil and defend a broad privation theory of evil. I think Alex Proust has done some work on the privation theory of evil somewhat recently. as well. Again, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but it is an important thing to think about. The reason we're not going to spend a whole bunch of time on it is because I don't think it, while it does some important work, I think it's a mistake if theists think that the problem of evil goes away just by advancing a theory of privation. Why? Well, simply because of this. Like even if defects are not a thing, that doesn't mean that nothing is defective, right? Clearly, things are still defective, and we still want to know, well, why are things defective? And is it still compatible with God that He would create a world of defects, even if He doesn't have to like actively bring about a thing with positive ontological status that is evil? We still want to know why God created a world with holes in it, if you will, right? So I don't think that the privation theory of evil by itself has a whole lot to say when it comes to the evidential problem of evil. Now, the evidential problem of evil, where a lot of the debate is today, the most interesting aspects of the debate, at least to my mind, really just sort of argues that the sort of suffering and evil, the bad stuff of our experience, is much better explained, much better to be expected, better predicted by, naturalism than traditional theism. And this is confirmatory of naturalism to whatever extent. Some people will think that it's hugely confirmatory. Other people will argue that it's just it's a more mild weight in the scale. So you can think about these sort of evidential comparisons. Just think of a scale, and one plate is traditional theism, and one plate is naturalism. Now, I'm not saying that these worldviews form a partition. They don't. I don't think they do, anyways. But let's just say these are the two ones that we're respectively comparing, and we're going out and we're trying to decide on what's all the sort of relevant data that these big picture theories need to explain. Well, bad stuff seems to be one of those things, right? And the evidential argument of evil was saying that bad stuff goes on the side of naturalism. And some people will say this is like a boulder, right? It's a boulder that goes on the side of naturalism. It just completely presses it down. And sure, it doesn't offer like a proof of naturalism, but it just makes it so that the existence of God is very, 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 very improbable, and that a rational person should really be a naturalist or something like that. So that's it in a nutshell. Of course, there's going to be many nuances to everything I'm discussing here today. I can't cover them all, so I'm just trying to give the big picture. And in fact, that's really what this article is about. So we should get into it now. I'll pull it up. And the purpose of this article, and what I hope to do here for the remainder of this episode, is just map the terrain. I just want to map the terrain of the different sorts of responses that theists can give and have given to the problem of evil, just to make you aware of it. Just let this be broadly educational. Because why? Because the literature on the problem of evil is enormous. It's enormous. There's no way that anybody could really keep up on it. So what I've tried to do is just assemble what I think are the most interesting, the most prominent, and in various respects, the most promising avenues for a theist to take in response to the problem of evil. Now, I've kind of broken them up into 8 different responses. Let me say right from the outset that the boundaries, of classification here are not so easy. They're not so clear cut. So somebody might say, look, I really wouldn't call some of these approaches totally distinct or different. I would actually lump them together. If somebody really wants to press that point, fine. I'm not gonna fight about it. This is just sort of how I carve up the territory. And there might be positions that seem initially similar, but once you kind of get into the details of the accounts, they appear to me to be sufficiently different to categorize them into separate camps. An example of this, we'll get into it, would be Peter von Ingewagen's defense or weak theodicy compared to skeptical theism. Some people might want to classify von Ingewagen as a skeptical theist, but when I read other skeptical theists, and then I read von Ingewagen, I just would put him in a different category, a category that we'll talk about here in a minute, which is called a weak defense I'm sorry, a weak theodicy or a defense. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's see. Should I enlarge this? Might be if you can just pull this up on the Substack if you want to get a closer look. But for now, like I said, the problem of evil suggests that the bad stuff of the world counts as evidence against the existence of God, and that some think that the evidence from bad stuff to naturalism, or let's say a hypothesis of indifference, and there I'm just following Paul Draper, who's probably the most formidable thinker when it comes to advancing the problem of evil these days from an atheistic stand side. He just his hypothesis of indifference is that there's just nothing at the bottom of reality that has any sort of agency or intention, right? Whether good or bad, right? I'll just use the term naturalism from here out. I understand that naturalism has become very liberal in recent years, and that there are certain people that would call themselves naturalists, panpsychists or something, that might put mind at fundamental reality. I'll tell you what, when I was a naturalist, if somebody would have proposed that to me, I would say, that's fine as a theory, but I just wouldn't consider that naturalism. Again, I'm not going to fight the point here. If you think that is a form of naturalism, fine. I don't know what else to say at this point, but I'm just going to use the term naturalism for the sake of simplicity from here on out to mean mind is latent local, right? It's latent local. Whatever is fundamental, way back, deep down, however you want to think about it, it ain't minded, right? So it's sort of reality is run by this principle of indifference, if you will. Okay, that's following Draper here. And the argument, of course, is that the bad stuff of our world is much better to be expected on a principle of indifference rather than, say, a principle of perfection, where God is the most fundamental entity, right? Okay, so theists have responded to this in several different ways, this challenge. And like I said, I'm just going to break them up for you and give a brief explanation of each. I'm not defending either of these approaches. I'm not considering, again, I'm not presenting them rigorously, and I'm not objecting to them either. Obviously, all these approaches have huge amounts of literature behind them, tons of back and forth, advocates, opponents. I'm just making them known. And if any of you guys want to go further, by all means, I would encourage you to do so, right? I'm just, again, trying to just show you guys a range of options. I say a range because I'm sure there's approaches here that I'm not aware of. And maybe there's some very good ones I'm not aware of. Like I said, the literature on the problem of evil is enormous. But I've done my best to just assemble what I think are the most interesting, relevant, and promising. Okay. By the way, if you're not subscribed to my Substack, please do that. I would appreciate it. I make all the content free, by the way. So I know a lot of people use Substack as a way to charge people for content. I make all my content free on Substack, just like, all the podcasts are free as well. Of course, if you want to donate and you do want to subscribe and be a paid subscriber to Substack, I would really appreciate it and be under many obligations to you in terms of thankfulness and whatnot. But you're not going to get anything extra. It would just be like a little thank you note to me. And again, it would be a very welcome thank you note. But it's all free. Okay, so here's the 8 approaches. Let's get into these. All right, so I here's how I break it out. The 8 approaches or the 8 responses to the problem of evil from theists are as follows. 1, the we know that God exists approach. 2, the total evidence approach. 3, the weak theodicy approach. 4, the strong theodicy approach. 5, the stronger theodicy approach. 6, the reformed epistemology approach. 7, the skeptical theist approach. 8, the God is not a moral agent approach. Part of what inspired me to write this article was an article that was sent to me by Dr. Jonathan Fuqua, who's developing what he calls a holistic response to the problem of evil, where he actually incorporates elements for a lot of these different approaches. I thought it was really cool what he's doing. And it actually is kind of similar to how I respond to the problem of evil in my upcoming book with Sophia. So I just want to give a shout out to him, and I hope to have him on the podcast next month to actually dive into some of the details of his account. But for now, we'll just keep going on this. So here's the 8 approaches. Again, I understand the boundaries are not clear. Some people might not agree with my divisions. That's fine. You can yell at me in the comments. All right, so let's go through each of these one by one. The we know that God exists approach. Okay, so this to me just seems like the most traditional approach to the problem of evil, right? And I borrow this term from Brian Davis, He talks about this approach in his wonderful little volume, An Introduction to Philosophy of Religion, which I've recommended before. This is the newest edition. And this is like, I don't know, also the most straightforward approach to the problem of evil. It's also, all these approaches are controversial. What in philosophy isn't controversial? So I'm not going to say that they're controversial or not, because that's just everything's controversial, right? It's uninteresting to say that something is controversial in philosophy. But all right, so what is this approach? Well, here's the claim. It's a claim that there are some features of the world, some undeniable feature or features of the world, or even just the contingent world itself, that just demands God as its necessary condition, as its necessary explanation, right? And arguments for this claim, call them metaphysical demonstrations, have been ventured from prior to Plato. I think Plato actually gives such arguments himself, as we've discussed in conversation on our series of Plato, onward to today. There's still many proponents of this approach, the approach of saying that there are just metaphysical demonstrations or proofs, properly understood, for the existence of God. And by the way, if you go to my Substack, you'll see that I link to relevant works of each of these categories. So what's linked there is Gavin Kerr's work, where he thinks that Aquinas' De Ante is a successful metaphysical demonstration for the existence of God, right? Again, whether you think that's the case is irrelevant at this point. I'm just saying this is an approach because its application to the problem of evil is actually pretty straightforward. If there is a really actually successful metaphysical demonstration for God, then we know that God exists, which means that the probability of naturalism is zero. And probability zero is sticky. It's not something that can be lifted at that point. At which point, like, the problem of evil, evidential considerations of evil are just irrelevant at that point, right? They're just it's not even germane anymore. Nevertheless, being sane-minded individuals, I say, we don't deny that the occurrence of bad stuff is easy to think about or anything like that. But rather, if you take this, we know that God exists approach, what you'll say is, look, the problem of evil isn't really like a problem for theism. At worst, it's just a sort of theological mystery that we need to kind of like think about and try to work out in the realm of theology, right? But it's not something relevant to either confirming or denying God's existence, because we already know that God exists because of this argument or that argument or whatever, right? And the simple point is this: like, if two things are actual, right, existence of God, and we know that through metaphysics, philosophy of nature, or whatever, and the occurrence of evil, which we know through direct experience, if both are actual, they must be compatible, okay? Even if we don't see immediately how they're compatible, we know that God exists, so they must be compatible. Jim Madden and I, if you've been following our series on Plato, suggested this is something like this is kind of going on in the Timaeus. Like, it just seems obvious to Plato that on a good philosophical analysis, God exists, good exists. So he doesn't think like the bad stuff of the world counts as evidence against God. He rather infers a sort of best of all possible worlds type of view on things. Definitely different than Leibniz, but also very interesting. Again, whether you think his account is any good is irrelevant, but it's clear that this is sort of in the background of what's going on with Plato and his natural theology and making sense of the world of becoming in relation to being and all that sort of thing. Okay? All right, so that's the first approach. And that's going to be appealing to people who think that there are, who like the old school traditional metaphysical demonstrations. If you think that those, if one of those on the market is successful, then this approach is probably available to you. But that brings us to the next approach, which is the total evidence approach. So fans of Swinburne. Now we're thinking more of somebody like Richard Swinburne here, who try to make a more cumulative case for God. They're setting aside this idea that there's any, series of deductive steps we can take to God's existence, but rather what we do is we are engaging in worldview comparison, right? We have these competing big picture paradigms, and somebody like Swinburne is going to say that God is a very simple hypothesis and better explains a wide range of data that stands in need of explanation compared to its rivals. But such a person who's taking the total evidence approach might just concede that evil is better explained, predicted, anticipated by naturalism. But what they'll say is, considering our total evidence, right? In light of our total understanding, come back to the scales, right? Think weights in a scale. Yeah, we'll just give it to the naturalist. We'll just give you the problem of evil. Maybe it's even pretty heavy, but the theist is taking all these other considerations, and those are even heavier. So once we really weigh everything out, maybe we're willing to say, yeah, the problem of evil is a problem for theism. But at the end of the day, once we've taken into consideration all the relevant considerations, theism still comes out as the better worldview, if you will. And like I said, the sort of, I guess, champion of this approach would be Richard Swinburne. His book, His Existence of God, is a good example of this. But if you want something a little slimmer, I actually just got this one recently. This one is There a God? I never got this one before because I understood this was his more sort of slimmer, more popular introduction, and I already had Existence of God. But actually, I got this just for my road trip to Florida. It was just a little light reading. It was really good. It was really good, and I didn't think like it was too diluted or too much was missing. Obviously, Existence of God is much more robust in terms of its explication and defense, but I would totally recommend this as an introduction to Swinburne's approach and methodology. And of course, the problem of evil and his response to it factors in this one as well. All right. Okay, so that's the total evidence approach. Maybe the theist is willing to admit that the bad stuff is evidence against theism, but when we take everything into consideration, the scales still tip in favor of theism. So the problem of evil, even if it's a problem, is not like a catastrophic problem, right? Okay, so that's the total evidence approach. All right. Again, if you want to read more, it's in the blog. All right, weak theodicy. Weak theodicy. What is a weak theodicy? Well, sometimes it's called a defense in the literature, but we're going to call it a weak theodicy here. And a weak theodicy appeals to some potentially justifying reason that, for all we know, might be true if God exists. So Peter von Inwagen, who's got some really fascinating stuff to say on the problem of evil in a book called The Problem of Evil, develops a defense or weak theodicy. And Plantinga also has a weak theodicy as well, but we're going to talk about Plantinga here with a different approach soon. So we'll focus on von Inwagen for now. So von Inwagen claims that all we need to defeat the evidential problem of evil is some possible story that has the right sort of consequence or consequences, one which an ideal agnostic, which von Inwagen takes a lot of time to explain what that is in his book, but one which an ideal agnostic is willing to admit might well be true if God exists. So von Inwagen's weak theodicy is really one of mild skepticism, namely that if one is not able to assign a probability range of bad stuff on theism, which he argues is the case, then one is quite obviously not in a position to say the probability of bad stuff on naturalism is higher than the probability of bad stuff on theism. Now, importantly, though disputably, I think once you get into the details of the different authors here, I really don't think I would classify von Inwagen as a skeptical theist. He does deploy various forms of skepticism. For example, he deploys a pretty heavy modal skepticism, which in a footnote in this article, I say that if you follow von Inwagen here, then that's fine. But we have to understand that systematically, that sort of modal skepticism will probably cut against some positive approaches, positive arguments for the existence of God as well. Von Inwagen is very consistent with this, by the way. He does critique a lot of positive approaches to God as well. So I don't think any charge of him being inconsistent holds. But anyway, so he does use some skepticism, but I think his is a not too skeptical theism, if that makes sense. But again, people might disagree, and you might just want to say that von Inwagen is just a skeptical theist. If so, then you have 7 rather than 8 approaches. That's fine. So yeah, let me read the rest of this here. So yeah, I think that the approach differs from a skeptical theist because the claim of a weak theodicist, again, as I understand it, is not that we cannot see what a God-justifying reason might be for permitting evil, only that we cannot see whether the story which includes such a reason is actually the true one, only that for all anyone knows, if God exists, it might well be true, and for all anyone knows, the reasons identified might be might be God justifying, if you will. So again, I'm leaving out a lot of details of these individual accounts. I'm just making you aware of the approach and encouraging you to go dive deeper. Von Inwagen's approach is actually, I think, really brilliant in a lot of respects. And one of the things that he deploys um, is difficulties concerning vagueness and arbitrariness, and how he uses that to try to explain why even seemingly arbitrary or gratuitous instances of suffering might not at all be surprising, given that God exists. Right? That's one of the I think very cool and moves that von Inwagen makes. That makes me commend his account. I think it's really good. You should definitely get his book on the problem of evil. His section on divine hiddenness also really, really good. So yeah, all right. So that's a weak theodicy. Let's keep going. The strong theodicy, as the name implies, wants to claim more. Typically, in a strong theodicy, the claim is that we actually do know what God's reasons are, or at least some of them, for allowing the bad stuff. All right. And this is Eleanor Stump's approach in Wandering in Darkness. And it's a book I cannot recommend enough. I've talked about it a fair amount on this podcast before. I'm not going to go over the details again. But Stump's strong theodicy is different than like a soul building theodicy. Because it's not about God just creating a world of stability where we can form certain virtues. It's really about God treating a spiritual cancer and setting the conditions for ultimate union with him. That is an important difference. Again, once you get into details, that is an important difference. And I think it is a considerable strength of Stump's strong theodicy over other soul building theodicies like Hicks or something like that. Okay. Again, I'm not going to get into details of Stump's account. All I'll say is this is just such a phenomenal book. Wandering in Darkness right here, especially how she uses various biblical narratives. Really very profound. I think I literally think it's the only philosophy book ever, maybe the only book ever, that actually almost made me shed a tear. I'm not really a weepy guy. But this one really moved me. So I'm not going to say anything more about it except for encourage you to get it. I think her work is very good and very powerful, and it treats the problem of evil with sufficient care, sufficient attention, sufficient sympathy, but also sufficient rigor. Hard to find that balance. Von Inwagen's rigorous, but boy, is he cold sometimes. And I know that can be off-putting to people. Again, I think when we're doing philosophy, we have to just grow up and realize that all views are open to a sort of cold analysis of reason. But there's something about the problem of evil that a tender touch in dealing with it, I think, is also called for in many instances. And Stump definitely has that. Okay, so let's just contrast real quick now the weak and strong theodicy. And I think maybe one of the best ways to do this is just take a quote from von Inwagen. Where S stands for the bad stuff of the universe. So just think of S as whatever the bad stuff is in our universe. And the quote is this: suppose that one were successfully to argue that S was not surprising on theism, and not because S is just what one should expect if theism were true, but because no one is in a position to know whether S is what one should expect if theism is true. So that's a weak theodicy, right? Whereas a strong theodicy claims that S actually just is what we would expect, or near enough, if theism is true. So you can see how the weak theodicy is more modest. And again, I can totally see how somebody would just say that, yeah, that's a form of skeptical theism. Again, I'll just say that once you get into the more specific accounts of the different authors, I just think that they're sufficiently different to put von Inwagen in his own camp. Either way, a weak theodicy claims that we aren't able to make really an evidential comparison with any real confidence, whereas a strong theodicy says that we can, and that naturalism fares no better than theism for anticipating or explaining a universe like ours, including its with a focus on the particular distribution of bad stuff. All right, now there's the stronger theodicy approach. So our theodicy has been progressively working out using a little bit of progressive resistance. Started as a skinny lad on the bench press, got stronger, and now it's getting stronger still. So what is the strongest theodicy approach? Well, it claims not only that bad stuff is actually just what we would expect if theism is true, but it's actually not what we would expect if the hypothesis of indifference were true. So importantly, this takes matters further by arguing that the bad stuff of our universe falls within a particular range, that it's like a particular arena, right? Say it's a range particularly well suited for soul building or treating spiritual cancer or achieving union with God or something like that, right? And this is actually confirmatory of theism and disconfirmatory of naturalism. So this is like philosophical judo going on here. It's trying to not just neutralize the problem of evil, but actively reverse it. And this approach is most rigorously developed in Trent Doherty's book, The Problem of Animal Pain, which is also one of my favorites. I think a really important contribution. And it's not just important because it takes a stronger approach to theodicy, but it grapples specifically with the problem of animal pain, which I know is something on a lot of people's minds. And he's got an entire theodicy for animals as well. And I think it's actually very beautiful. Anyway, so that's what he's up to. So I think the best way to summarize the stronger theodicy approach is just to compare it to arguments from fine-tuning. So the idea is something like this, right? That the distribution of evil could have fallen along many different dimensions. It could have been far worse than it is. It could have been far less, or it could have even been done at all if naturalism were true. However, it seems to fall, or so somebody like Doherty would argue, along the rather narrow dimensions that are conducive for goods considered to be of the highest value by most of us, and especially by religious people. Doherty outlines what those goods are in his book. You'll just have to go read it. Theism. So the further claim is that theism actually predicts this narrow range. That this is exactly what we'd expect if theism is true, but naturalism does not. If we were just to leave it up to chance, we could have fallen all over the map, right? There's a huge amount of other possibilities that we could have landed into concerning the distribution of bad stuff. But given that we fall just within that narrow range predicted by theism, again, this sounds kind of like a fine-tuning argument, right? If anything, that's evidential confirmation of theism and disconfirmation of naturalism, or so Doherty argues. Again, I just emphasize I'm not defending this approach right now. I'm just telling you that it exists and what it's up to. Okay? So that's just stronger. It's not just trying to neutralize the problem of evil and say, hey, we have no reason to think that naturalism really does better anticipate the distribution of suffering. The strongest theodicy approach says not only is the distribution of bad stuff in the world exactly or close, just the sort of thing we would expect if theism is true, it's not what we would expect if naturalism is true. And so the problem of evil, upon substantial analysis, or so the argument goes, actually points the other way around. It's going to be confirmatory of theism, or at least some specific type of theism, rather than naturalism. Okay. All right. Now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about the reformed epistemology approach. Okay. Most people, if you're in these circles, this is most strongly associated with Alvin Plantinga. Let's see here. I did get some of the books to show you. This would be really the one to go to, the most substantial one to go to, Warranted Christian Belief, for more details on this. For a slimmer volume, Knowledge and Christian Belief. All right, so how best to summarize the reformed epistemology approach? Well, probably as follows. So Plantinga rejects that God is really supposed to be like an explanation of things in the world, or at least that's how we come to be justified in God. Plantinga is saying that's the wrong way to think about it. Rather, Plantinga will argue, is we are well justified believing in God because such a belief is the deliverance of properly functioning faculties operating in their appropriate environment. So he obviously defends and develops an externalist theory of knowledge and a specific account of proper functionalism. Okay, so in application then for Plantinga, this is going to make it so that theistic belief is basic and non-inferential, sort of like my beliefs that there are other people in the room with me, if there are other people in the room with me, and that they are minded like me, like beliefs in other mind or memory beliefs, stuff like that, right? That these are basic non-inferential beliefs, and we're well justified in it because of this account of proper functionalism. It's not something we reason up to, right? They're beliefs that are just naturally occasioned in us. Now, ultimately, making a long story short, the key to Plantinga's response to the problem of evil is that theism could actually be improbable on propositional evidence and yet justified on non-propositional evidence. And the details of this, of course, are very intricate. That's why you got to get his book. But the all too short story is that Plantinga believes that this his theory of knowledge, his externalist theory of knowledge, really offers something of an evidential shield, and a really strong one, if not a totally invulnerable one, around theistic belief, such that a theist can be well justified believing in God, even if they don't have any arguments for the existence of God or any responses to the problem of evil. Okay, so that's the Reformed epistemology response. Of course, has generated an enormous amount of literature all on its own and is utterly fascinating, and you should read about it. All right, skeptical theism. This is endorsed by a lot of people. A lot of people who've been on my show are skeptical theists. I don't put myself in this camp personally, but it is a popular approach. And the camp of skeptical theism, again, is broad with vague boundaries, but ultimately skeptical theism embraces two claims as set forth by Timothy Perrine. And I'm quoting: first, even if theism were true, we should be skeptical of our abilities to reasonably predict all of God's plans for organizing the world, including those about the amount and nature of evil. Second, if this first claim is true, then it undermines or otherwise greatly mitigates arguments from evil. So that's what skeptical theism is all about generally. All right, so said differently, the skeptical theist argues our inability to not see a reason for God's permitting bad stuff is not a reason to assume with any confidence that there is no reason. So not seeing, as the slogan has it, is not seeing not. Moreover, says many a skeptical theist, that we should not actually even expect to see a God-justifying reason, because God's reasons are probably God-sized and we're just not that big. That is a horribly inadequate overview of skeptical theism. Of course, there's many more nuances and details to that account, but that is my overview. So there you go. Get what you pay for. By the way, for people, again, let me just emphasize that throughout this article and the links and footnotes, I give many more resources for further reading and stuff like that and study. All right, last one here is the God is not a moral agent approach. This is most rigorously advanced by Brian Davis. Do I have his book around here conveniently? No, I don't think I do. That's okay. We won't show and tell it. It's around. It's probably downstairs. So Davis maintains that because God is not a moral agent like we are moral agents, he argues the problem of evil is just totally misguided right from the start. So Davis emphasizes that when we say God is good, we're not saying God is morally good or well behaved. Of course, he's going to say that we're not saying God is not well behaved either, or something like that, or is ill behaved. But for Davis, God is no more subject to the natural moral law than God is subject to natural physical laws, because God is what creates and sustains these. God is the reason for there being any natural moral law or natural physical laws at all. So us sort of throwing moral expectations on God as if God is just some sort of very large gentleman who has similar duties and obligations as every other created human being. Davis he's arguing that's a profound category mistake. That's a profound category mistake. And Davis will tell you that God has no virtues and no vices, because when we think about what these are, it doesn't make any sense to attribute those to God, because God has no dispositions and he cannot be perfected. God is just perfection itself. And obviously Davis is a classical theism, right? So a lot of this is appealing to the transcendence of God, right? And by extension, Davis will say God has no duties or obligations. God is just not the sort of thing that can be described in this sort of way. But as Davis will argue, because the problem of evil really assumes this sort of understanding of God or something kind of similar to it, Davis just rejects the problem of evil as fundamentally ill-framed. He thinks it's just a non-starter once these various faulty assumptions are fixed. So that is Davis's approach to that. And of course, you can find that most developed in his book, The Reality of God and the Problem of Evil, which is linked here. And then at the end, I give a few notes on my preferred approach. What does Pat Flynn like? I'm not going to defend it here, but I'll tell you, this is something I thought a lot about, right? I really think something like Doherty's approach is actually correct. There's a sort of huge shift that happened to me the more that I've thought about this and read the relevant literature, and and just through personal experience and stuff like that, that yeah, like it does seem like we kind of have fallen into um, a particular arena that is well suited uh, for, I actually think, Stump's story. So I think that Doherty's general stronger theodicy approach is correct, that you actually can reverse the problem of evil. I would try to develop it a little bit differently, focusing more on the types of things that Eleanor Stump outlines, like internal integration, internal psychological integration, curing of spiritual cancer, and union with God, not just kind of general soul building. I don't necessarily know if Doherty would disagree with that, but that's where I would go. And in fact, that is where I'm going in my upcoming book with Sophia, which, by the way, I should mention, I just talked with my editor last week. It looks like June. Looks like June is the tentative release date for my book with Sophia. But anyways, that book has a chapter, very long chapter on the problem of evil, where I try to develop something of a stronger theodicy, and I incorporate aspects and elements from many different thinkers, from Maritain, Lonergan. I haven't mentioned either of those two people here. Doherty, of course, Stump, von Inwagen, especially considerations of vagueness and stuff like that, into an account that I think shows that that the problem of evil can actually be reversed. But then I make this little disclaimer that even if that approach failed, I don't think I would be too worried about it, because I still think that there are successful metaphysical demonstrations for God, and there's other very strong confirmatory evidence, and there's always the kind of fallback, weaker theodicies and stuff like that. And for those reasons, I'm not too troubled. I'm not too troubled by the problem of evil, intellectually speaking. And I say that because, look, not too troubled, because in my sober moments of rational reflection, I really do think that there are good arguments for God, and good rejoinders to the problem of evil. But look, we all live in this world, right? We are all suffering, and my general posture is that people are suffering very much more than they typically let on, very much more than they will typically let you know. And we should always be sensitive to that. And of course, if you're coming from a Christian perspective, we're called to care for that. I think most people would agree with that, even if they aren't Christian, and do everything we can to try and alleviate that. I think, however, that here, I'll just get the screen out of the way now so you can get a close up of this ugly mug. I think that philosophy can help. I really think that it can, because let me finish with this. Sometimes people talk about the philosophical problem of evil and the pastoral problem of evil. It's the philosophical problem of evil. We try to get nice and sober and just think clearly and chop logic and respond, right? But the pastoral problem of evil, where people are actually suffering, leave that to the priests, leave that spiritual advisors, and I don't know, man. To me, philosophy has really helped me in a pastoral sense. I mean, there's something of a great help that I receive from thinking through these matters very carefully, and they're difficult matters, that helps to facilitate a greater vision of hope and purpose. And how is that not pastoral? I'm not going to say that's going to be the case for everybody, but it has been for me. Sometimes you hear this saying, everything happens for a reason, right? And now I think that's a really lame thing to say when somebody's like dying of bone cancer. I think that's a very imprudent thing to say in a moment like that. However, if a certain paradigm is correct, a certain theistic paradigm is correct, there could be like there could be philosophical ground for thinking that's actually true, and that even the worst instances of suffering are redeemable, can be redeemed, can be defeated, right? And I find great hope and help in that, even if I don't see how exactly all that works out, how uh, how it all ends, right? And I think anybody claiming that they do see how it all works out is not being sufficiently humble. I think you can still have good reasons for thinking that it does, and I think that itself can be um, extremely therapeutic, extremely therapeutic. Now you have to be careful that you don't just go on believing that out of wish fulfillment or whatever. Um, but that doesn't mean that uh, you shouldn't believe it. I do believe it. I think it's true. And I think that can give you great hope and help and perseverance uh, in those very dark and difficult times in your life. Thank you.